What's up, gamer? My name's Waluko, and today we're going to talk about the most baffling change that was announced for Path of Exile 2's 0.5 update, specifically the addition of in-game build guides. First of all, I call the change baffling, but I do think having in-game build guides is a good idea, because following a build guide is certainly easier than trying to make your own build in either of the Path of Exile games, but even with a guide, it can still be difficult to get all of the things you need in the right places, especially if you're a new player who's not familiar with all the systems that may be talked about in a build guide outside of the game. So I do think it is a good idea to give players a way to get that information as directly as in the game's interface and pointing out which nodes to take on your tree and all that. I was just so baffled by it because I never actually heard of anyone asking for a feature like that, and it kind of came at the end of the hour-long content reveal that showed off like an entire new endgame, and then it was just like, oh yeah, by the way, your build guides are now in-game. Like, oh, whoa, that's crazy. The other reason I was so baffled by the announcement was that there is one other in-game feature that a lot of people have been asking for a very long time, and I never asked for it anywhere publicly, but like, I do think it would be a really good idea to add this to the game, and that would be in-game loot filters. Last Epoch was the first ARPG I played that had an in-game loot filter, and I didn't really get terribly in-depth with it, but even having the ability to just change which color different pieces of my loot was highlighted with on the fly as I was playing the game without having to go to a third-party website or like move stuff around in my computer, or open up Notepad++ or something like that. It was an eye-opening experience, and honestly, ever since I messed with that the first time, I have wanted it in Path of Exile. On top of that, Diablo 4 just released its Lord of Hatred expansion, which also added an in-game loot filter that does look suspiciously a lot like the Last Epoch one. So after all this time since Last Epoch gave us their in-game loot filter feature, Diablo 4 has finally caught up to them and added their own loot filter feature, and then we get Path of Exile 2's next big update, and what do they give us? They give us in-game build guides, which it kind of seems more ambitious from like a UI standpoint, and I do intend to use this feature both for following other people's build guides myself or for making my own build guides and letting other people import those in-game if they want to, at their own risk. But I can't tell you how many times I've been farming at different levels of intensity in Path of Exile 1 and 2, and just been like, man, I wish I could change the way that this one specific item shows up on my loot filter, but then I also don't want to go through all of the hoops that you have to actually do that in the current loot filter system. The thing is, anytime I can think of in the past where Path of Exile's developers have been asked about adding an in-game loot filter feature, the response has usually been something along the lines of, adding a feature like that will give the player the expectation that they're supposed to make their own loot filter, and that can be a very challenging and overwhelming thing to do, especially with all the different items and valuable things you could find while you're farming in Path of Exile, and basically any level of difficulty. I do get where they're coming from with that, and so I think it's a good thing that the current loot filter systems exist as they are, but I think having the ability to quickly and easily adjust how things show up when they drop in-game is too nice to actually go without, honestly. I'm not sure how technically feasible it would be, but if the developers didn't want to saddle every individual player with the responsibility of knowing how to categorize and show every piece of loot in the game, then they could just give us the option to have like a main loot filter through like the Path of Exile website or Filterblade or our files or whatever, and then give us the in-game filter on top of that, which could basically overrule stuff. So if you want to use like a very strict filter from Neversink, but you're a really big fan of the Reign of Chaos card in Path of Exile 1, which is hidden on those kinds of strictnesses, then you could just make a rule on your in-game loot filter that says, play the tink noise when the Reign of Chaos shows, and make a big red star on the map and all that. And just so that we don't have to interrupt our moment-to-moment gameplay when we make the realization of, oh, this needs to change. Let me go in my loot filter menu, change that real quick, and then get back to what I'm doing. I think that's way better than the way it currently is, where we have to figure out how to do that manually. After seeing the way that they're adding the in-game build guides, I do think there's a slightly higher chance that they may get around to giving us in-game loot filters, specifically because one of their main objections to the idea of in-game loot filters, like I said, was overwhelming the player and making the player think that they have to do the loot filter business in order to play the game effectively. I think adding in-game build guides kind of does the same thing, but the way that they're getting around that is they're not revealing the interface for the in-game build guide system right away. Like, you don't open your passive tree and get a little pop-up that's like, what build guide are you following? You specifically have to go get a .build file from whoever made the build guide and then drag that into a specific folder on your computer in order to make the build guide show up in game. I have no idea how that's going to work for console players, and I hope they do have a way for console players to make that work. But whatever the case, they basically are just obfuscating the function behind something that you have to know. Like, I want to take advantage of the in-game build guide. So I'm going to follow these steps, and only after you follow those steps do you actually see the feature in game. That does prevent people from being overwhelmed by it, and I think they could probably do something similar with an in-game loot filter feature. And that's already how the main loot filter system kind of works, but they could probably do something similar just by hiding a simple button somewhere in the options menu that is not readily apparent, and that should do just as well for keeping any new players from getting overwhelmed at first. I think the in-game build guide feature is good, and I really do hope they find a way to add in-game loot filters to both Path of Exiles. But what do you think? Would you be too overwhelmed if you found a loot filter feature in your options menu? Do you intend to use the in-game build feature? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more like it, don't forget to like and subscribe. Lastly, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in another video.